Good morning, students, and this week we're going to be looking at American History 2, week 28. We're going to be looking at finishing up Taft's presidency. We're going to take a look at the Titanic, the election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson's first term as president, the start of World War I, and a Progressive Era review, and also, even though it's not on here, tensions between the U.S. and Mexico. In 2 weeks, so not next week, but the next week, we will be having a test over everything we've covered since our last test. I will be sending out next week a study guide for you all. I do want to go ahead and get through with World War I before I give you that test. That's why we're not doing it next week, because this week we're not going to be able to get through World War I. But I do want you to be aware that that test is coming up. That's why I'm going to be doing a bit of a Progressive Era review this week. And the next week, I will probably take a look and compare the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era side by side, so that you can get a little bit more in-depth look at that for when we do our test. So last week, we started looking at William Howard Taft's presidency. I don't remember if I said this, but William Howard Taft was basically put into the presidency by Theodore Teddy Roosevelt. So Roosevelt decided not to run for a third term. At this time, there were no limits for terms. There were no term limits, so you could essentially, he could have run for a third term and have been a president for a third term, but Roosevelt decided not to do that and instead put forward one of his good friends, William Howard Taft, to be the next president. And Taft was overwhelmingly elected because the people liked what Teddy did. Remember, Teddy was our first Progressive Era president. He was all about the square deal with attacking and doing those 3 C's, which were consumer protection, fighting back corporate greed, and conservation, protecting the land. And that's what Teddy was known for, and people wanted to see those things continue. So Teddy put forth Taft and said, here is Taft, here is my man, who's my good friend, who will continue what I've started. And we're actually going to see that Taft isn't really able to continue what Teddy started for anything other than trust. Taft is going to really use, and we saw that last week, he's really using that Sherman Antitrust Act to break up those trusts. And he's going to fight those trusts. Before his term is over, Taft only did 1 term, he busted over 90 trusts. And it's very important to remember that Taft did not care whether it was good trusts or bad trusts. He didn't care. He wanted to bust them all. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So Taft was Teddy's a really good friend, and he gets the presidency, and then Roosevelt and Taft's friendship starts to break apart. And we're not quite sure what started the friendship to fall apart, except we think that Taft he never felt like he was the president. We know that for certain. He only felt like he was a placeholder for Teddy, and that he was just doing Teddy's bidding, and that the presidency was not his to claim. And Taft also didn't like being president. It stressed him out a lot. He gained a lot of weight. He overate and gained a lot of weight, over 400 pounds while he was president, because of how stressed he was. So we think that started the rift between Taft and Roosevelt's friendship. As you saw last week, that their friendship started to fall apart as soon as Taft became president. And that's only going to continue to fall apart with Taft's support of people that kind of undermine everything that Roosevelt stood for. Roosevelt, if we remember, he slashed down tariffs. If you remember, tariffs are a tax on imported goods. So Roosevelt really lowered those tariffs down. And we thought that Taft was going to continue with that, and it looked like he might, but then we had the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which really raised tariffs back up to what they were before Teddy, and Taft really supported it. In fact, at one point from last week, you should remember, he said that it was a great tariff thing, it was exactly what the people needed, and that really disheartened the people of the U.S., and it upset Roosevelt. And then Taft is going to support two other people that are really going against what Roosevelt stood for. The first one being Richard Bollinger. It is on the screen. I don't know if I can. Oh, wait, maybe I can. Let's see. Richard Bollinger. Oh gosh. Did not mean to do that. Yay, I can erase. Okay. Sorry guys, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. Anyways, so that man, he was a rich lawyer who was very anti-conservative, conservation. And remember, not conservative, because it's not the thing. Remember that conservation was a big Teddy thing, and this Richard Bollinger was put in a position of high power by Taft and supported by Taft, and he was anti-conservation and ends up selling 1 million acres of Alaskan reserve lands. These lands were rich in coal to coal miners, so the lands are gone, basically. They're going to be destroyed for coal mining. And Taft supported this decision, and that really, again, just further caused the rift between Roosevelt and Taft. And that rift is just going to continue with also an issue with a man that was the Speaker of the House, who was a purely conservative Republican and would not put forward any progressive ideas, even for a vote. And we'll talk about him more when we get into the election of 1912. So for now, let's go ahead and go through this timeline right here. So this is the second part of that first term, starting in October 1911. We did the first part of the term last week. Taft tours the West, October 1911. So he's taking a tour around, like, trying to build up his voter base, see parts of the U.S., all that fun stuff. And then October 26, 1911, Taft files suit against U.S. Steel. I already mentioned he's very, very much antitrust, very big on busting all those trusts. November 10, 1911, Carnegie Company is founded. Carnegie Co. January 6, 1912, New Mexico becomes a state. January 17, 1912, Taft calls for an annual federal budget. January 22nd, 1912, American troops in China because of the Chinese Revolution. So there was a Chinese Revolution going on in 1912, in January of 1912. And Taft sent in American troops to protect American interests in China. So that was China becoming a republic, forming a republic, and overthrowing the Qing dynasty, Qing dynasty. Queen, I don't know how to say that, but anyways, they were overthrowing that dynasty, and America just wanted to make sure that American interests were protected, missionaries and trade and all that fun stuff. So they send troops to China. that's kind of along the same line of Teddy Roosevelt's policy, speak softly and carry a big stick. So, February 14th, 1912, Arizona becomes a state. February 20th, 1912, Taft nominates Milan Pinckney. You should be able to see that right here for Supreme Court. March 14th, 1912, the Justice Department halts the merger between the South Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads. So the South Pacific Railroad was a railroad, and the Union Pacific Railroad was another railroad, and the two were going to come together, but the Justice Department says, wait, no, because trying to prevent local companies from starting. March 27th, 1912, Washington's first cherry trees are planted in Washington, D.C. I personally believe that's some of where the cherry tree myth comes from. You know, Washington as a kid shot down a cherry tree, and when he was asked, said he couldn't lie, but he did it. That's not true. That is a fairy tale or a tall tale, but April 9th, 1912, creation of the Children's Bureau. So the Children's Bureau is going to work on child labor laws. So at this point, there were no labor laws for children. If you were a child of any age, you could work in any conditions for any amount of hours for very low wages. In fact, generally a lot of children were working because they needed to help their families out. So this Children's Bureau is going to put regulations into place about how old you have to be able to work, how long you can work at certain ages. So, like, let's say you can't work at all until you reach age like 16, and then you can only work for a certain amount of hours for a certain amount of days every week. The regulations that we really needed in place are also conditions. They're going to make regulations for the conditions that children need to be working in. April 14th, 1912, the Titanic sinks. We're going to look further in detail at the Titanic in a little bit. June 5th, 1912, Marines land in Cuba to enforce the Platt Amendment. We talked about the Platt Amendment last week. This was an agreement between the U.S. and Cuba that was basically the only way for the U.S. agreed to remove troops from Cuba. Please put in the comments down below the points of the Platt Amendment, like what the Platt Amendment was said, what was in that agreement between the U.S. and Cuba. This is part of class period. I will be looking in the comments for comments on this, so please make sure to put them in the comments down below. What the Platt Amendment, what Cuba agreed to do or not to do in regards to U.S. and Cuban interests in the Platt Amendment. I can remind you of one, which is that no foreign country's military base would be put on Cuba. See if you can remember the others and put them all down below in the comments. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. On June 18th, 1912, Taft wins Republican nomination over Teddy Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was looking to run for president again. And this is in large part due to the rift that has been created between Taft and Roosevelt. June 19th, 1912, Congress passes a labor law that only allows people to work 8 hours. So again, there were no laws, not only for children labor laws, but there were no labor laws in general for people. So instead of the 8-hour days, 9 to 5 that we think of now, or anything within that scope of time, you could just go into work and be at work for hours and hours and hours for very little pay. So that labor law kind of helps fix that. July 2nd, 1912, Woodrow Wilson gets the Democrat Party nomination. And we're about to see the Democrats just know that they have a win coming up due to a party split with the other major party, the Republican Party. August 5th, 1912, the Progressive Party is formed. This party is also known as the Bull Moose Party, and they nominate Teddy Roosevelt for president. So this is when the Democrats pretty much knew that they were going to win, because this Progressive Party, or the creation of the Bull Moose Party, that signified a split in the Republican mainly party, although there were some Democrats who were part of the Progressive Party, but mainly it was the Republican Party that had split. So we knew that the likelihood of Wilson getting the election is very high, and we're going to see that in the election of 1912. I almost said 1812. Okay, August 20th, 1912, U.S. battleships are sent to Nicaragua to protect U.S. interests. Again, political unrest. We send in troops to protect U.S. interests. August 24th, 1912, the Panama Canal Act that keeps American ships from having to pay tolls when using the Panama Canal is signed by Taft. Now, this is a break, or it is seen as a break in the Hay-Penforth. Sorry, it's hard for me to say that. Hay-Penforth. We looked at it last week. Treaty agreement between Britain and the U.S. Basically that agreement allowed the Panama Canal to be created because they made agreements between Britain and the U.S. that made that canal be deemed okay by Britain. So Taft signing into effect this American ships don't have to pay the toll is a break in that treaty. And it's seen as a break in the treaty not only by Britain, but by several U.S. people as well. So people are not happy with Taft at this point. September 24th, 1912, Marines are sent to Santo Domenico. It's right down here. I just highlighted it. Again, political unrest. We send people in to protect U.S. interests. October 30th, 1912, Vice President John Sherman dies. November 5th, 1912, Woodrow Wilson wins the election. We're going to look at that election in a little bit more detail later on. February 14th, 1913, Taft vetoes literacy tests for immigrants. So, if you remember from the Gilded Age, people were not wanting immigrants to come into the U.S. They thought they were taking jobs of actual U.S. citizens and hurting just the U.S. in general. So they were looking for ways to keep immigrants out. And one way would be this literacy test. So it would test how much knowledge you had and how well you could read and write. And so it would be a very good way to keep especially lower class immigrants out of the U.S. But Taft was obviously against this and was like, no, we don't need this test for immigrants. But we're going to see it pass under Wilson anyways. On February 18th, 1913, General Hirata, forgive me for the butchering of the names, right here, overthrows Mexican President Madero. Again, I don't speak Mexican. So he's overthrown by a general. The president of Mexico is overthrown by a general. And the public is not happy about this. They're like, oh my gosh, U.S., intervene, stop this madness. And the U.S. this one time is like, no, we're not sending in troops, we're not intervening, no. And the public is not happy about it. The public's like, why? Why? We don't want you to intervene, and you intervene, and then we want you to intervene, and you won't intervene. So... And this overthrow is going to actually cause a lot of tensions between the U.S. and Mexico under Wilson. And so we'll see that a little bit later on. Okay, and then February 25th, 1913, the 16th Amendment is ratified, which means it goes into effect and is accepted as an amendment to the Constitution. And the 16th Amendment put into place income tax. So the ability for the government, the federal government, and I think the state government, but I won't swear to you on that, to tax your income, what you earn from doing your job. So income tax had tried to been passed, people had tried to pass income tax before, and people were like, no, it's unconstitutional. So 16th Amendment to make it constitutional. March 1st, 1913, we have the Weeb-Keaton Interstate Liquor Act that prohibits the shipment of liquor into dry states, passed by Congress against Taft's veto. Now, dry states or dry places, like we have a dry county in Alabama. Blount County, the county I live in, is actually a dry county. These are places where liquor or alcohol are prohibited. They're not allowed to be sold or bought or used. No alcohol. So we don't have dry states anymore. We now have, there are some dry counties. Blount County is the only dry county in Alabama. I think there's a dry county in Tennessee, but I don't know the list of all the dry counties. But there are still some dry counties, which are areas within states that are considered dry, that alcohol is prohibited in. But as far as dry states, we don't have those anymore. But at this time, we did, and we're starting to see the start of basically of prohibition. So states are saying, no alcohol allowed in our state, and this is going to kind of open the door for the 18th Amendment, which is going to be prohibition, and it's the Protestants that are mainly supporting prohibition and our move into prohibition, and it's kind of weird that prohibition even passes, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail when we get to that, but it's very, they win, but they don't win ultimately, because ultimately, obviously, prohibition gets stricken, because now alcohol is no longer illegal unless you're underage. Okay, and then March 4th, 1913, Congress divides the Department of Labor and Commerce into two separate departments. Nothing big there. Alright, we're going to look at the Titanic. So the Titanic was a luxury cruise ship that was built in Belfast, Ireland, and it was a British ship. So it was a ship that was owned by Britain. It was British, but it was being built in Belfast, Ireland. The ship, they started building it in 1909, and they finished in 1912. And it took a total of $7.5 million to build this ship. And that is a picture of the ship on the screen, in case you didn't know what the Titanic looked like. The Titanic was one of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners, and it was designed to be one of the largest luxury passenger ships in the world. Its length was 882 feet, its height was 175 feet, and its width was 92 feet. So that's like a really, really big ship, especially at the time. It was the largest ship of the time. The ship weighed 46,000 tons. The Titanic had cabins for first, second, and third class. So they each had different styles of cabins made for each of them. First class was close to the deck, the top of the ship. The third class was close to the engine rooms, and the engine rooms and boiler rooms and all that technical stuff was beneath the waterline of the ship. When the Titanic shipped off on her maiden voyage, there were 2,240 passengers from all different walks of life on the ship. You had billionaires, like robber barons. You're actually, Strauss is going to be on the ship and going to die. And another robber baron, Astor, was on the ship with his new wife, who was pregnant at the time, and she got off and survived, and her child survived, but he was not allowed on a lifeboat, which we'll look at in a little bit. One of the most notable features of the ship was its grand staircase. If you look up Titanic, a lot of times you will still see pictures of that grand staircase with a domed skylight. Although the luxury did not stop there, as the ship also contained a gym, a barber shop, several dining rooms, a Turkish bath, a reading room, and a pool, just to name a few luxuries that were all contained within this ship. And the ship was so elaborate that, like, second-class cabins in the ship were comparable to first-class cabins in other ships. That's how, like, fancy the ship was. When the ship left on her main voyage, she only carried 20 out of the possible 64 lifeboats. So the ship could carry up to 64 lifeboats individually, but it only had 20. This was because they didn't want the deck to look cluttered. But this meant that there were only enough lifeboats for approximately half of the ship's population. Each lifeboat could contain around 65 people. So out of 2,240 people, there were 20 lifeboats which could carry about 65 people. That's about half of the population. So, but this was acceptable at the time. This was acceptable business practice, as generally lifeboats were understood to be a means of transport from a sinking ship to a rescue ship, and were not meant to hold people for long periods of time. So the Titanic was a big deal. It was written about in the news a lot before its maiden voyage, and almost everywhere where you see it written about, it was called the unsinkable ship. And this was due partially, in fact, to the bragging of the people who created it that it was unsinkable, that it could withstand anything. And part of the reason for their bragging was due to the hull of the ship, which was made up of 16 watertight compartments. And it was said if even up to 4 of these compartments flooded, the ship would still be buoyant, would still float. So, unsinkable ship. At noon on April 10th, 1912, the Titanic left England and set sail for America under the command of Captain Edward Smith. The Titanic stopped in France and Ireland to pick up more passengers, so we got the 2,240 passengers, and then set sail towards New York, full steam ahead. On April 14th, 1912, there were reports of icebergs, so the captain plotted a new course and kept the ship headed towards her destination full speed ahead. This was standard practice at the time, although it would have been more advisable to have slowed speeds down at night. Especially, it was just a bad timing for these people that all this stuff's about to line up, because once it became dark this night, not only were temperatures dropping, making it very, very cold outside, making icebergs even more probable, but also there was no moonlight this one night. Even though it was a clear, star-filled night, there was no moon. It was a new moon. And there were no waves either. The sea was perfectly calm. And believe it or not, you actually do want waves when you're out there, because waves can crash against the icebergs. And if you don't know what you see, the top part that you see of an iceberg is not all there is of an iceberg. There's actually a lot of ice underneath the waterline. That's one of the reasons icebergs were very dangerous to ships. So, there was a person up in the crow's nest, which is the tallest part of the ship, looking out for icebergs. And at 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the ship's lookout spotted an iceberg from the crow's nest and rang the warning bell to let the people in control of the ship know there was an iceberg. And he called down to the people and called out, "Iceberg right ahead." And those are the words, iceberg right ahead, not iceberg dead ahead, iceberg right ahead. However, there were a couple of things that are about to happen that make this not so good. He had spotted this with his eyes, which means they were really too close to it to do anything at this point, even though they're going to try. But they're going to try in a manner that's actually worse than if they just slammed right into the iceberg. So they were headed straight for an iceberg. He saw it with his eyes. rather than binoculars, because the ship's binoculars had been locked away, and the person that had the key was removed from the crew last minute and hadn't given anybody else the keys, so there was no way to get into the binoculars. So it was just with his pure eyes that he saw this, and the ship was headed straight for it. So for some reason, the crew, even though they were an experienced crew, decided to try to turn the ship and like not hit the iceberg. So when they turned, they actually scraped the hull of the Titanic against the iceberg down the side. So like imagine you like slam into it like your car, and just like a wall, and like you scrape your car along the wall. Probably a car might just get scratched, but the parts of the hull actually got ripped open for the Titanic, and so it put several holes below the waterline on the ship. The collision with the iceberg was not felt by the people on the ship, and everybody thought it was okay, but except the crew, or the crew who knew about the collision and went down to the boiler rooms to check out the damage, and the 6 of the compartments had already started to flood. It was just no good. So at 12 a.m., the Titanic's captain sent out a distress call and gave orders for the passengers to start getting in lifeboats. The lifeboats were to be loaded up with women and children first, as this was protocol. However, due to the confusion and the disorganization of the people on the ship, the first couple of lifeboats that actually left the ship were only half full. So they could fit 65 people, and they only had about 20 on them. And part of the amount of confusion that was causing issues with these lifeboats was the fact that no drills had been run. There were no practice drills. There was no talk about what would happen during an emergency because of people's arrogance with thinking this was an unsinkable ship. The ship's crewmen on the boat took different meanings for the order of women and children first. One side of the ship thought that it meant all women and children around the area got on the boats first, and then if there were men around and they could fit them, that they would get on the boats too. Meanwhile, on another side of the ship, the man took the order to mean only women and children could get on the lifeboats, no one else. So, like I said, that rich man who was on the boat with his wife who was pregnant, he asked to get on the boat with her because of her delicate condition and was denied. So he ended up going down with the ship. There were 2 ships, and it only has one on here, but there were 2 ships that were away from the Titanic, which are going to kind of hear the, I just did quotations, even though you can't see me. They're going to hear the call for help, but they're not really both going to hear it. That 12 a.m. SOS telegram was actually the first SOS ever sent out on a telegram, and it's going to be heard by a ship called the Carpathia, which is the ship was about 58 miles away, and so it's going to try to get there, but it's not going to get there until 4:10. And remember, he sent out the SOS at 12 a.m., so 12 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. It's going to take about 4 hours for the Carpathia to get there, and they did intercept that SOS distress call. But there was another ship that I didn't put on the thing there that was actually seen by the people out in the ocean, and it had running lights, and people started sending up flares, like the crew started sending up flares asking for help at the Titanic, and that ship didn't answer them. It didn't come by to check anything out. In fact, its running lights went off. It's believed now by a lot of experts that it was an illegal whaling ship, and it didn't want to come over because of the fact that it was whaling illegally. By 1 a.m., the front of the ship had begun to sink below the surface of the water as the lower decks flooded up. And the water was coming in faster than it could be pumped out, and this was only added to the fact that people had left their portholes open. So the ship, if you think about it, is like supposed to be flat in the water, and then the front of the ship is starting to dip under the water. the ship's gonna go like almost straight up in the air, not quite a nosedive, making like the hull up, or not the hull, the top deck like up and down before it breaks in half, and that's what it's going to do. It's going to break in half. So by 1 a.m., the front of the ship had sunk below the surface of the water, so lower decks flooded. The back of the ship and its propeller rose high into the air. Panic was in full force now as people tried to fill as many as they could into lifeboats. There were some people that just accepted their fate and didn't even try to get into a lifeboat. The most recognized people that didn't try to get into the lifeboat, besides obviously the captain who went down with the ship, and a lot of his crewmen that did too. The band, there was a band playing in one of the dining rooms of the ship, and they just said, you know what, we're going to go out doing what we love, making music, and they continued to play until they could no longer keep their footing because of the steep incline of the deck. And they continued to play to try to keep people calm. And the Strausses also accepted their fate, and it was the Strauss and his wife stayed with him, and so they both stayed together while the ship went down. By 2 a.m., the last lifeboat had left, but 1,500 people were still on the ship. The deck was now at a very steep height, and many passengers fell into the icy water. And at 2:17 a.m., the captain announced every man from his cell as the boat gave way to the pressure and broke in half. So at this point, the boat was pretty much almost straight up and down, and at one of the fault lines, I'm using quotations there, fault lines, it gave to the pressure and just broke. At some point, the captain went down with the ship, along with many other crew members. The main form of death was hypothermia. The water was very, very cold, so within 15 minutes of being in the water, you would basically freeze to death. Although several people did die of drowning as they were sucked down with the ship. So the ship, as it sank over 2 miles to the ocean surface, it did kind of act as like a vacuum, and it did pull people down with it. Some of the lifeboats did return to try and find other survivors. How only four people were found alive in the water. The Carpathia arrived on the scene at 4:10 a.m. and they would pick up the lifeboats. Later, the McKay Bennetts went out and recovered about 400 bodies from the area of the disaster. That left 1,100 bodies that were never seen again. Only 705 passengers survived the disaster. This is one of the worst disasters in our collective history. An interesting little thing about the Titanic is it was actually almost premonitioned, and I'll leave that up to you to decide whether or not you think it was really premonitioned or it was just a coincidence. But a woman wrote a book called The Titan, and she got so many details of the Titanic, of what would happen with the Titanic, right? Her ship was called the Titan, and you have the Titanic. Her ship went on its maiden voyage and was an unsinkable, again I'm using quotations there, ship, and in April, and it sank. She was only off by a little bit on how heavy the ship was. She detailed how many passengers were going to be on that ship, and that 1,500 were going to die. It's eerie how similar to this disaster that book was several years before that disaster, before the Titanic sank. Again, just a horrible, horrible disaster. There are several Titanic museums that you can go visit that tell a good history. A lot of the people who died, there were children that died. Over half of the children on the ship died. A lot of if you were third class, pretty much most of the people in third class did pass. Because remember what I said, their cabins, their areas were near the engine rooms of the ship. So their stuff started to fill up with water first, obviously. And then next was second class, and then first class, obviously. Moving on from that, you've got the election of 1912. So Taft and Roosevelt had split the Republican Party down the middle, which we already talked about this. Progressive Republicans supported Teddy Roosevelt and all he stood for, while more conservative Republicans supported Taft. And this is the progressive era, so obviously that's going to be a pretty big split. The people are wanting reforms in this era, so. The split had started in 1910 and came to a major head not just with the election of 1912, but also earlier around the Speaker of the House, Joseph Cannon, who was a conservative Republican and would not even put forth progressive ideas for a vote in the House. Taft, knowing this, supported Cannon, so Taft knew what Cannon was doing, and Cannon was being very bipartisan and very unfair towards progressive Republican ideas, and Taft still supported Cannon. So the progressives joined forces with the Democrats of the House to remove Cannon, and then once Cannon had been removed, the progressives rallied around Roosevelt, and they formed the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. And they got Roosevelt to run for office again. The Bull Moose Party was known as the Bull Moose Party because it was a comment that Teddy made when someone questioned his health, and he said, "I'm as healthy as a bull moose." And that was actually really true because during one of his speeches, he got shot at. He actually got shot, like a bullet lodged in his chest. And he just pulled himself together and kept giving his speech, even though he'd been shot. Because what more can you expect from someone who just mans their way to health when they're a sickly child? It's important to note that Wilson was a progressive as well. So he wasn't not progressive. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. He wasn't a progressive Republican, but he was a progressive. He was a progressive politician. He had progressive ideas. He supported. He's going to support several things that Roosevelt supported, but Wilson was very much more. He was less obnoxious like Teddy was. Like Teddy, you either liked him or you didn't like him. Like there was no. Teddy could very much be considered. People felt about him kind of like Donald Trump. You either loved him or you hated him. And Wilson was calmer, and he had a statement about how, you know, the people, Teddy's something real that the people can fawn over, and I am less tangible, but I will give you results. And I mean, Wilson is going to do some good things, but he's also going to do some things that are just like, you know, you didn't think that through very well, did you, Mr. Wilson? But it is obviously still the progressive era, so we're still wanting to see changes and reforms socially, and we're going to get some of that with Wilson. Wilson did overwhelmingly win as far as the electoral votes. Only 8 of the states did not vote for him. However, Wilson did not overwhelmingly win on the popular vote. He only got 41% of the popular vote. So that's not an outstanding show of support for Wilson, but it's not horrible. Roosevelt did come in second place, getting 80 more electoral college votes than Taft. So if it had been Teddy rather than Taft as the Republican nominee, I feel like the likelihood of Roosevelt winning a third term would have been pretty high. If we want to compare this election to another election, we would do well comparing it to the 2000 election between Al Gore, George W. Bush, and Ralph Nadler. I don't know if any of you were alive for that election or paying attention to politics for that election, but Bush barely won. And this was most likely due to Nadler taking votes from Al Gore because it was very close between Bush and Al Gore. So, again, Nadler and Al Gore were Democrats, so that Democratic Party was split. And when you have a split if it's a two-party system like we have here in the U.S., the Democrats and the Republicans, and any party splits, obviously the other party is going to win the election. Which I personally feel was part of what happened with the 2016? Was that when we elected Donald Trump? I think that's when the year. I'm not good with years, guys. But I think that even though the Democratic Party did not split like vocally, like we did not have another party pop up like in the election of 1912 with the Bull Moose Party, there were a lot of people who wanted to vote for Bernie who didn't support Hillary or voted third party, because we do have a third party in the U.S. But there were people who didn't feel comfortable voting for Hillary in the Democratic Party, so that Democratic Party was kind of split, and that's what led to Trump winning the election. And I think if things continue down the path that they are on right now, we may see that split again, especially if Joe Biden gets the nomination, the Democratic nomination. So, okay, we're going to go on and look at Woodrow Wilson's first term as president. So Woodrow Wilson is going to go after what he called the triple wall of privilege. Remember that. That's a big thing. Woodrow Wilson, triple wall of privilege. Kind of like Teddy Roosevelt, 3 C's. Wilson, triple wall of privilege. That triple wall of privilege was tariffs, trusts, and banks. It was actually tariffs, banks, and trusts, if you want to do them in the correct order. He's going to attack tariffs with the Underwood-Simmons Act, which is basically going to really, really massively cut tariffs. Excuse me. He attacked banks by putting the power of the banks in the hands of the federal government with the Federal Trade Commission, which is going to, Republicans, not a big fan, the Republicans were not happy with his choices there. And then he attacked trusts with the Clayton Antitrust Act, which built on the Sherman Antitrust Act but was better, and basically attacked a bunch of not-so-nice business practices that were legal, and it made those not-so-nice business practices illegal, things such as false advertisement and price discrimination. So let's go ahead and look at this timeline. So this is first term part 1. We're only looking at Wilson's first term today. So March 4th, 1913, Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated as president. April 1913, Ford Model T assembly line starts. Y'all got a handout on this last week, and we briefly touched on this. So Ford's creating the assembly line and the Model T car. And this is just more of a show of how we have entered the industrial age. April 8th, 1913, Wilson speaks before Congress about tariffs. This is the first time a president has spoken before Congress since John Adams. So before, when we were talking about presidents addressing Congress, it was always through letters. It was through letters that would be read by the people of Congress. And now, with Woodrow Wilson, we're going to start seeing the president actually in person coming before Congress and speaking directly to Congress rather than doing a letter. And that's kind of what pushes Congress to be like, okay, yeah, we'll get rid of tariffs, because they're so shocked that the president's here and he's speaking to us. What's happening? May 2nd, 1913, the U.S. recognizes the Republic of China. So remember, we talked about with Taft and Taft sending American troops to China to protect U.S. interests in China due to the revolution thing going on in China. Well, that revolution thing going on in China was the creation of the Republic of China, which we're now recognizing. May 14th, 1913, the Rockefeller Foundation, started by Rockefeller, obviously. And again, this was a charitable organization. that Rockefeller put a whole lot of his own money into. So he was a somewhat upstanding robber baron. May 19th, 1913, Webb alien land-holding law that prevents Japanese people from owning land in California is passed. Wilson did not support this. He very much didn't want this to pass, but it still went through in California, and this was just another example of discrimination between the people of the U.S. and aliens or immigrants. May 31st, 1913, the 17th Amendment is put into place. This amendment puts the election of U.S. senators in the hands of the people. So before the 17th Amendment, senators were not picked. They were not voted on by the American people. And this amendment, the 17th Amendment, is putting the power of the people, or the election for the U.S. senators in the hands of the people. So it's a pretty big step. And Wilson was very much for this, and he was very much like, hey, people, if you want change, you need to vote in senators that you want, that you think will give you that change. So, August 27th, 1913, foreign policy with Mexico is unstable as Wilson refuses to recognize the general's authority. So remember we talked about with Taft, we had the president of Mexico getting overthrown by General Harundi. I know I'm saying that wrong, I'm so sorry. But that general overthrew the president, and Taft didn't send in any U.S. forces into Mexico, but Wilson's not sending in forces right this second. Like, he's not sending in any U.S. firepower yet. Please notice my large asterisk with a yet there, because we're going to talk about that when we get to tensions between the U.S. and Mexico, and we'll talk about it in detail in another slide. But that hasn't happened yet. So, but Wilson's also like, you're not the president. So, October 3rd, 1913, Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act goes into effect, and it greatly reduces the U.S. tariffs. So this was Wilson attacking tariffs, like I said he was going to do. And then October 10th, 1913, the Panama Canal is completed. So remember that Panama Canal, that's, a lot of people died, by the way, in the construction of the Panama Canal. Mostly due to malaria. If you don't know what malaria is, it's I was going to say a virus, but it's a sickness. I'm not sure if it's a virus that is transmitted to people from mosquitoes. So there was a lot of swampland down where they were building the Panama Canal. And so a lot of people got malaria and died. But it's going to be completed now. So there's that canal connecting the two oceans, which the U.S. will control until in recent history, recent times, we've given up control of the Panama Canal to China, which was probably a mistake on our part, but I digress. December 10th, 1913, I'm gonna mess up that name, Elihu, Elihu Root, wins the Nobel Peace Prize for his work as president of the Carnegie Endowment Fund Company. I can't think of the word for it, but it's a Carnegie's charity. That's what charity. So yay for him. And Root was secretary of something under Roosevelt. I can't remember what. So if you remember, Roosevelt won the Nobel Peace Prize while he was president. December 23rd, 1913, we have the Federal Reserves Act that creates the Federal Reserve System is signed. And so it's signed December 23rd, 1913. This act was also known as the Owen Glass Act, or the Currency Bill, or the Federal Reserve Act. So this is going to be our national banking system. And if you will remember, we kind of played around with a national banking system before Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson was like, nope, unconstitutional. National banks are bad. Get rid of them. And so he completely got rid of our national banks and just stopped national banking from being a thing. And we had the pet banks, if you remember from that political cartoon we looked at earlier this year. So we are seeing a basically resurgence of a national banking system or a federal bank, but it's not going to be like the national bank like we had before Andrew Jackson, because times have changed, and obviously our bank needs to keep up with our industrial side now, because we're no longer mainly agricultural. Now, the reason that a lot of people want a national bank rather than private banking, which is what we had up until Wilson here, was because the private banking was more left at the whims of capital, and I used quotation marks there, the whims of the of capitalism, and it was more fluid and national banking in theory would be more stable than private banking, and plus it gives the government more control over your banking. So there's pros and cons to both having a national banking system and not having one. But the private banking kind of closed off banking and made banking to be more for the elite class. So this national banking system that we're going to have with the Federal Reserve Act is going to open up banking more to the people, to the non-upper class people. Obviously, when we're going to look at the Great Depression, we're going to see that a national banking isn't necessarily guaranteed to be more stable than private banking. However, national banking is helpful in giving us a national currency. Before, banks would kind of give out their own tenders, and those tenders wouldn't always be recognized across state lines, and money was messy. And a lot of times, if there was any kind of panic, which we've seen obviously a lot as we've gone through this course, if there was any kind of panic, people would rush to the banks to exchange their notes for gold and or silver, and it would cause the bank to collapse, and it was a big mess. And there was a really bad panic in 1907, and it's the Panic of 1907, which we did talk about, also known as the Bankers' Panic or the Knickerbockers Crisis. And this was a really, really bad panic, and really hurt a lot of private banks. And a lot of really big banks kind of had to step in and help out the little banks, and kind of ended up putting the bigger banks, getting their thumb on the little banks. You kind of holding them under their thumb. And so we're going to try to avoid that, obviously, with national banking. And it's also going to streamline currency and make currency the same, which is helpful. But at the same time, obviously, with the Great Depression, we're going to see that this plan is not foolproof. So we can really look at the Federal Reserve Act into three different sections, three different parts. Now, this act, the Federal Reserve Act, or the Owen Glass Act, whatever you want to, Currency Act, whatever you want to call it, created 12 Federal Reserve districts across the U.S. So you had the New England one, and then the Atlanta one, and the Richmond one, and the Cleveland one, and then there's like a New York one, and a Philadelphia one, and a Chicago one, and a St. Louis one, and a Kansas City one, and a Dallas one, and a Minneapolis one, and a San Francisco one. So those are how the 12 Federal Reserve districts are kind of split up. And if you look up the 12 Federal Reserve districts, you will see a picture of how the districts are kind of split up on the map. These Federal Reserve banks are bankers' banks. So there aren't tellers. It's not like you and I think of a bank. It's very much their stock in the Federal Reserve is owned by bankers, so they can vote on the president of the Federal Reserve. It's like spaghetti trying to get through all that. Now, this Federal Reserve banking system is still owned and controlled privately by bankers. However, it is regulated by the Board of Federal Reserve Governors. And there's supposed to be 7 people on this board who kind of regulate the banks and they're appointed by the president, and they make sure that everything is A-okay. Now, these people that are regulating the federal reserve banks, they're supposed to try to keep inflation and deflation down, keep that everything steady, make sure we don't have a lot of unemployment. That is their job. Now, they don't always do their job, and it is a great debate as to whether or not these issues are something that should be monitored by the federal government or not. I'm not here to tell you one way or the other on that. I'm just here to tell you that that's what they are there to do. I'm going to put a link in the description. When my lesson here is done, I want you to go to that link, and I want you to go watch that video as part of class as well. It does a really pretty decent job of explaining the Federal Reserve Act better than I could probably do right now. Because it's a whole lot of mumbo jumbo, and I don't expect you to necessarily remember everything that he says. I just want you to kind of get a better idea as far as the Federal Reserve Act goes. Okay, so we're going to move on from that. April 9th, 1914 through April 25th, 1914, we have tensions at Tampico between the U.S. and Mexico, and Tampico was a port in Mexico. And we're going to look at those tensions on another slide. So I'm going to just skip over that for now and keep going. May 7th, 1914, Mother's Day is established. So remember to thank your mother for all she does for you this Mother's Day. And remember that it was created in 1914. It hasn't always existed. May 8th, 1914, we have the Smith-Lever Act that provides funds for agricultural instruction is passed by Congress. So this act provides funds to people who want to learn how to do agricultural stuff. June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. And there's going to be another link in the description down below. You need to go to the video that I'm linking down below as far as this goes as well. It'll be the second link down below in the description. Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated is what sparks off the start of the Great War that will later be known as World War I, or the war to end all wars. Originally, once the war was over, but obviously it wasn't the war to end all wars because we're going to have World War II. But, yeah, we're starting to see the start of World War I. August 4th, 1914, Germany launches war on Belgium, France, and Britain, and also Russia, even though I didn't put Russia up there. So, there's a whole lot that goes into the start of the war and World War I in general and how we got involved, and we're going to look at that in more detail in our lesson next week. But for now, know that it was a lot of imperialism, also a lot of nationalism, a lot of national pride, and a lot of secret. I used quotation marks there because how secret were they really? It's debatable. But secret alliances between different countries over in Europe. All that has kind of created this power keg, or this gunpowder keg that's just waiting to explode, and we get that spark that explodes that keg with Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination. And we will look into a lot more detail of that next week. August 15th, 1914, the Panama Canal officially opens. September 26, 1914, Federal Trade Commission is established. October 14, 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act, strengthening the power of the Sherman Antitrust Act, is signed by Wilson. And so again, this is just Wilson making a lot of practices, a lot of bad business practices that we consider, like, if you heard them today, you'd be like, oh my god, the business did that? But back then was not treated that way. It was just kind of like, oh, okay, so that happened. But this Clayton Antitrust Act is going to nip those bad business practices and stop them in the bud. Nip them in the bud and stop them. If you remember correctly, the Sherman Antitrust Act, when it first went into power, or was first signed into being, was first approved, was very weak and was actually used more to be used against unioners that were trying to fight for better working conditions than it was against the businesses themselves. We're not going to see that same problem with the Clayton Antitrust Act. It's going to be a lot stronger. Okay, January 2nd, 1915, literacy tests for immigrants is approved. Again, this is what I talked about before, where we have the tests to decide whether or not immigrants can come in. People aren't wanting immigrants to come in, so obviously these literacy tests are going to slow down the influx of immigrants into the U.S. January 25th, 1915, we have the first transcontinental telephone call. So, obviously, we had the Transcontinental Railroad, which, if you remember, means the railroad stretches across the whole continent. This is the first transcontinental telephone call, so the first telephone call that reaches across the continent. January 26th, 1915, Rocky Mountain National Park is established. February 23rd, 1915, Nevada signs the Easy Divorce Bill. So this is just a bill that lets people get divorces really easily. Like, you have to only be a resident of Nevada for, like, I think it was 6 months before you could get a divorce. So people would go there to get easy divorces. May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat sinks the British passenger liner the Lusitania, off the coast of Ireland, killing 1,198 civilians, 114 of which are American. This is what was needed to kind of bring the U.S. into the war with Europe. Now, this isn't going to officially bring us in quite yet. We are not going to declare war against Germany until 1917. I want to say April of 1917. So it's going to take us a while. I mean, this was 1915. It's going to take us, like, almost 2 years, because this was May. I think we go and we declare war against Germany in April, so almost 2 years. Not quite, before we finally gear into this war. Okay. And the reason, which, again, I promise we'll talk more, and I'll have, like, a slide so you can take notes, because this will be most likely a question on the test. The reason that it took us so long was because Wilson was very adamant that we would have a hands-off policy in the World War that was going on, the Great Wars it was called at this time. Wilson was very adamant about the U.S. not getting involved. He wanted to practice more isolationism than the policy, Teddy's policy of speak softly and carry a big stick. Like, Teddy would have been all in that war. Just look at how he supported the Spanish-American War. But Wilson was very much like, nope, we're not getting involved and we're neutral. But a thing that happened with us deciding to be neutral, is we decided that we could keep trading with countries on both sides of the war. And countries on the opposite side of, so like we were trading with Britain. Germany wasn't happy that we were trading with Britain, We were also trading with Germany. Britain wasn't happy that we were trading with Germany. So Britain was obviously a lot nicer about things, and they just detained trade ships that were coming from the U.S. to Germany. Germany started sinking our ships with their U-boats, which were basically submarines. So a lot less nice of a procedure in Britain. So that's gonna kind of, people are getting outraged, the public's starting to be like, hey, let's get in this war. And Wilson's still like, no, we're hands off. Although he did send some strongly worded, I was about to say emails. There weren't emails at the time. He sent some strongly worded letters and declarations of complaint to Germany, being like, hey, not nice. And the U.S. places blame firmly on you, Germany, for those lives that were lost, the sinking of the Lusitania. And Germany was kind of like, we're sorry, we didn't mean to. We weren't trying, because they didn't want U.S. to get involved, okay? They did not want the U.S. to get involved, because that would spell bad things for Germany. But at the same time, they also wouldn't admit that they had done bad things, and they're like, Britain was illegally shipping arms in that ship, and they're gonna sink some more ships, and we're gonna be unhappy about it, and then we're gonna get a telegram, which is ultimately going to push us to be like, all right, that's it, Germany, you've crossed the final line with us. Okay, then June 3rd, 1915, the District Court of New Jersey rules that U.S. Steel is a lawful company, so it's a win for U.S. Steel. They're not going down like so many other trusts that happened, like what happened with Taft, so yay. July 29th, 1915, U.S. Marines land in Haiti to help calm political unrest. The president of Haiti had been ripped apart by people due to political unrest. So even though Wilson was wanting to be isolationist, he didn't have a choice at that point. September 16th, 1915, Haiti signs the Proctoriate Agreement. October 15th, 1915, American bankers loan money to France and Britain to help with war efforts. So people are starting to come together to try to help France and Britain with war efforts, even though we're not haven't officially joined the war yet. We are starting to take some actions to help them out. December 4th, 1915, Georgia grants the KKK a state charter after nearly a decade of the KKK being quiet. We're not quite certain what caused that sudden resurgence, except maybe all the unrest that was going on with the U.S. and Mexico, and then all the unrest in Europe, just led the KKK to seeing the Ku Klux Klan to seeing a way to sneak their way on in there. January 24th, 1916, we have the Bushraber versus Union Pacific Railroad case. This versus, it was a Supreme Court case. And it was a landmark Supreme Court case, obviously, which most of them are, that we talk about here, in which the court upheld the validity of a tax statute called the Revenue Act of 1913, also known as the Tariff Act, which allowed the United States to collect income tax, or the 16th Amendment. And so basically, the Supreme Court decided that income taxes were not decided among the states according to each state's population. Then on January 28th, 1916, Wilson appoints Louis B. Brandeis Brandeis right here. To the Supreme Court. He is the first Jewish justice of the United States. Then March 28th, 1916, Pershing invades Mexico, and Pershing is also known as Blackjack. It's going to invade Mexico, going after a bandit that we kind of helped create. We're going to talk about that in more detail when we get to the tensions between the U.S. and Mexico slide. Then May 1916, Marines land in Santo Domenico to restore political stability. So, again, so much with that isolationism there, Wilson. And then May 5th, 1916, Sussex, I think it's Sussex, pledge from Germany to the U.S. after Germany sinks another passenger ship. Basically, the Sussex promise was Germany saying, we will not use our U-boats or submarines to attack passenger ships without giving them warning first. So basically, they were saying they're still going to attack passenger ships and blow them up, but they're going to give the crew and the passengers time to flee the ship before they blow it up. Obviously, the Sussex pledge is not going to last. Okay, I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. So this is the last part of Woodrow Wilson's first term as president. June 3rd, 1916, National Defense Act is going to go into effect. And that's in response to mounting tensions between the U.S. and Germany, and just gives more funds and power to the Army and Navy and all that, respectively. June 7th, 1916, Republicans nominate Charles Evan Hughes for president. Obviously, on June 14th, 1916, the Democrats are going to renominate Wilson. June 1916, issues between Mexico and the U.S. There's still issues running rampant between Mexico and the U.S. July 17th, 1916, we have the Federal Farm Labor Act. June 22nd, 1916, we have Preparedness Day parade bombing. So there was a parade going on for Preparedness Day. So Preparedness Day, basically that was an advocating for American entry into World War I. It was this parade was to encourage the U.S. to enter the war efforts, and this bombing that happened was in San Francisco, California, and 10 people were killed in this bombing, and it was a suitcase bomb. It injured 40 more people, killed 10, so in total 50 people were hurt by this bomb. And the people who were accused of doing it, it was on very shaky grounds that they were accused and arrested for it. Because there were people who supported Wilson's isolationist policies, and they were very anti-war and were very vocally anti-war. And that was, so again, the country's being split between anti-war and pro-war. I mean, I wouldn't say pro-war. I don't think anyone's ever like, yes, war. Well, that's not true. There are people that are like that. But the people that were advocating for a U.S. entry into the war were not pro-war, but they saw a need for U.S. to intervene. But there were anti-war people. A lot of the laborers, especially the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies, were anti-entering the war. So they had the bomb. The bomb went off a half an hour after the parade began. It was a bomb concealed in a suitcase. It exploded on the west side of Stewart Street, just south of Market Street, near the Ferry Building. And two radical labor leaders, Thomas Mooney, Mooney, and Warren K. Billings, were arrested and tried for the attack. In the trial that followed, complete with a false witness and a biased jury foreman, the two men were convicted, despite it was widespread belief that they had been framed. But the people they ended up, like, they were accused, and they one of them was going to be executed, but Wilson was like, that was a really biased trial. Let's look more into that. I don't think we did that right. And so they were eventually pardoned, and we don't know who did the bombing. Surprise! On July 30th, 1916, we had Tom's River Island explosion. So, Tom's Island, or Tom's River Island, was a island off the coast of New York that was really important when it comes to ammunition, or the building of arms. And this explosion exploded the factory that was creating a lot of arms. And it was a thought for a long time that this was it was an accident. The explosion was just an unfortunate accident. But come to find out later, no, it wasn't an accident. It was German sabotage, because German people knew most of the weapons were going to the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, and Belgium, I suppose, technically. We'll talk about it when we get into World War I. But the main players were France, Britain, and Russia. Because France and Russia were allies, and then Germany went through Belgium to get at France, and Belgium was like, please don't come through here, and Germany was like, we're going to come through here, and that's what got England into the war. But anyways, so that explosion, it killed some people, and did a lot of property damage, and was a German attack on U.S. soil, and we're still not getting into the war quite yet. It takes a lot for us to get into the war. It's really going to take the Zimmerman telegram to get us into the war. And then August 4th, 1916, the U.S. and Denmark signed a treaty for purchase of the Danish West Indies for $25 million. So the Danish West Indies are what are today the U.S. Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. So if you look up the U.S. Virgin Islands, you'll see what I'm talking about. August 25th, 1916, the National Park Service is established. September 3rd, 1916, Adamson 8-Hour Act gives railroad workers 8-hour workdays. So again, we see more worker reforms going on here, making conditions better for workers. Exactly what we needed. October 16th, 1916, nation's first birth control clinic is opened by women. November 7th, 1916, Wilson's reelected. December 18th, 1916, Wilson dispatches peace letters to all players in the war in Europe. So he's trying to get things to calm down. They've kind of reached a stalemate at this point. It was trench warfare going on, which, of course, we'll talk more when we get into that section next week. But it was very brutal, and it was just bad. And Wilson's like, can we stop? Obviously, that's not going to happen. January 22nd, 1917, Wilson's Peace Without Victory speech. It's a very famous speech. I will try to have a link in the description for you. It would be the third link down there in the description that will lead you to that speech. January 28th, 1917, Pershing is recalled back to the U.S. So Blackjack, the dude that went into Mexico because of the mess that we made. We're going to talk about that in just a second. February 3rd, 1917, Germany breaks its Sussex promise. So remember that promise where Germany was like, we won't bomb any more passenger ships without letting them know. Yeah, they're breaking that promise. They basically straight up tell the U.S., yeah, we're going to go back to bombing passenger ships. And the U.S. is like, you really shouldn't. And so at that point, the U.S. says, that's it. We're not helping you anymore, Germany. We still have not declared war against Germany. We still are not fully invested in the war yet. We're still kind of like, no, we're kind of neutral, but we're not dealing with you anymore, Germany. Basically like, I'm not going to talk to you no more. Then February 24th, 1917 to March 1st, 1917, we had the Zimmermann Telegram. Now, the Zimmermann Telegram was a telegram from the Kaiser of Germany to the Mexican president that we intercepted, and this telegram said, hey, Mexico, why don't you start a war with the U.S. so that they won't join our war over in Europe? And we intercepted that telegram. We were like, oh, no, you didn't, Germany. So we're about to jump into the war. Wilson's going to be like, Congress, we need to declare war on Germany. And Congress is going to go, okay, yeah, we should. But the reason that it stretches between that date is we intercepted it on February 24th, but it got published for the U.S. public on March 1st, 1917. And the irony of all this, like Preparedness Day and the telegram getting published to increase support for the war, the irony of all that is that during the war, Wilson's going to push things through that are going to majorly limit freedom of speech around the war and cause massive problems for the newspapers and news organizations during this war. And so we'll look at that next week, but it's not good. He crosses some lines that he didn't need to cross. Okay, tensions at Tampico between the U.S. and Mexico. So I talked about this briefly. On April of 1914, there were already tensions between the U.S. and Mexico as the U.S. refused to acknowledge the general who had taken over Mexico as the true ruler of Mexico. Things just got worse between the two, with Mexican officials detaining U.S. Marines at Tampico port. April 9th, 1914, in the port of Tampico, Mexico, Mexican officials detained several U.S. Marines from the USS Dolphin. Despite their quick release and expression of regret by President Victor Huerta, that's the general that we wouldn't recognize, by the way, the U.S. Admiral T. Henry Mayo demands that Mexican troops salute the American flag as a sign of we're sorry. President Huerta refused the demanded salute on April 11th. 3 days later, President Wilson orders American warships to Tampico Bay. April 19th, 1914, in order to obtain from General Huerta and his people the fullest recognition of the rights and dignities of the United States, President Wilson requests authorization from Congress to use force in Mexico. After some debate, both houses sanctioned such a force on April 22nd. On April 21st, 1914, at Veracruz, Mexico, U.S. forces seize a customs house. Marines occupy the city, and a detachment is sent to exact an apology from President Huerta for the arrest of several drunken U.S. sailors earlier in the month. April 25th, 1914, President Wilson accepts the offer of arbitration presented by the ABC powers of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile to resolve the Tampico controversy. This mediation proves unnecessary when Mexican President Huerta is forced to resign on July 15th. So let's talk about why he's forced to resign. We're going to go ahead and go to the next slide, which are other tensions between Mexico and the U.S. So we have that unwillingness to acknowledge that general because that general that we were talking about just a minute ago hates us. He hated America. And that wasn't the only reason we refused to acknowledge the general as the ruler of Mexico, but that was a large part of it. But also, a lot of Mexicans are coming over into the U.S., and the American people, just like a lot of people now in the U.S., wanted the border to be shut down. They wanted it to stop. They were like, enough of this. So in response to America's plea for intervention at the border, Wilson enters into a covert arms deal with 2 Mexican outlaws. So he decides, because there was no way for us to shut down the border. it was just too big of a task. It just wasn't going to happen. So Wilson goes, we're going to give guns under the table to these two outlaws, Carranza and Pancho Villa. So due to U.S. help, Carranza is able to take control over Mexico, but Pancho Villa is not happy about this. He's very mad. So he takes out his frustrations on the U.S. He enters the U.S. in two different invasions. There were quote marks there. I don't know that I call them invasions, but like two different attacks. He comes onto U.S. soil both in January 1916 and March 1916 and attacks and kills at least 30 U.S. citizens on American soil. So obviously we're not going to be standing for that. We're not happy. We're going to go after him. And Villa, he did what was best for Mexico, but he just went about it in bad ways. So in response to Villa's attacks, John J. Pershing, also known as Black Jack, is sent to Mexico to catch Villa and bring him to justice. Pershing is never able to actually get his hands and apprehend Villa. He is, however, able to break up Villa's gang after many, many months of chasing Villa throughout Mexico, which Mexican government, even Carranza, who we helped become the president, were not happy about having U.S. forces in Mexico. They were tired of U.S. intervention, and they wanted the U.S. citizens out. So there were some U.S. Mexican troops that did attack some U.S. troops during all this that killed some U.S. troops. This is all happening during World War I over in Europe. I want you to make sure you have that timeline in your mind. And then the distrust of Mexico and the Mexican people is ramped up with the Zimmerman telegram that we just talked about. Alright, we're going to do a progressive era review real fast. No more laissez-faire business practices. The 16th Amendment starts the tax on income. So remember, laissez-faire means hands-off. The government wasn't exactly laissez-faire. We use that just to kind of distinguish between the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, they weren't entirely hands-off. In fact, a lot of times they ended up supporting big businesses, not being just no hands on the big businesses. Muckrakers are still very important. These are the most notable ones. Jacob Riz, Ida Tarbell, Upton Sinclair, and Stephens. As far as politically, the progressives wanted two things: to curb corporate monopolies and to improve the life of the common people. The 17th Amendment puts the election of senators in the hands of the people, putting the people in more control over what's going on with their areas. The women's right movement is a massive player in this era. The 19th Amendment would give women the right to vote. We haven't gotten to that yet in our little timeline that we've been going through because the 19th Amendment is going to be during Woodrow Wilson's second term. Another massive movement in this era are child labor reforms, which we've been talking about. Civil rights for African Americans do not make strides during this era. Jim Crow laws are still in place across the country, which includes segregation. So whites only being able to use certain places. The main advocates for American rights are also pretty much disagreeing at this time. The most notable of these two people of African American rights supporters being Booker T. Washington, who said, "Cast down your bucket and go learn a trade." That's his famous line. He thought African Americans should go better themselves before fighting for equality. And Du Bois was his rival and was very much bashed what Washington had to say. He was like, no, the Jim Crow laws are wrong from the get-go. One African American that's just being reasonable is Ida B. Wells. I mean, I'm not saying that others aren't being reasonable by wanting to end segregation in that, because they were, but one that's like, can we not argue? And like, can we all agree that this is bad? Is Ida B. Wells, who was trying to stand up against the practice of lynching. If you don't know what lynching is, it is a horrible practice where they would take people and just think tar and feathering, but not quite for the lynching. The people are split into two sections, or or the people in this era are split into two different ways. You have them split into two twice. So you have progressives versus conservatives. Obviously that split put the first Democratic president in office with the election of 1912. And then you have the wet versus dry, also Catholics versus Protestants. The Catholics obviously believing that alcohol was not bad, while the Protestants believed that alcohol was bad. And this is obviously going to be leading us to the 18th Amendment, which is going to make the selling of alcohol illegal, also known as prohibition. And we'll talk more about that next week. I will be sending out an email to you with homework, so keep an eye out for that. Make sure you put that comment that I asked for earlier down in the description below, and any questions you had about our lesson today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in our next class.